Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Before I introduce our speaker, I've got like 2 seconds worth of things to say. You must have all gotten one of these in a pen. If you didn't, let me know. But if you fill this out, at the end of the speaker, at the front desk, you can exchange it for a journal. This is part of a grant that we got from the American Library Association. So we're trying to promote writing across campus. So these journals are for you to write in whatever you want. You'll be sent weekly prompts. If you have any questions, let me know. But I'm here to introduce our speaker. And as seventh generation Kansan, Eric McHenry teaches English at Washburn University and was the Poet Laureate of Kansas from 2015 to 2017. His books of poetry include Pot Scrubber Lullabies, which won the Kate Tufts Discovery Award, and Odd Evening, a finalist for the Poets Prize. His poems have appeared in the Threepenny Review, the New Republic, the Yale Review, the Times Literary Supplement, and Poetry Northwest, from whom he received the Theodore Ritka Prize. He also writes essays and criticism for the New York Times, the American Scholar, the Boston Globe, and other publications. Please help me welcome Eric McHenry.
Thank you, Cassandra, and thanks Seward County Community College. It's really a treat to be back after several years. It's just delightful to have an opportunity to talk to you all about poetry and watch you eat pizza. These are two of my favorite things, the poetry and the pizza. These are why I get up in the morning. I have copies of the poems that I'm going to be talking about. There are just 3 poems, and they're also going to be up on the screen here, but some of you are farther from the screen than others. Would folks like to have a copy of the handout with physical copies of the poem? Yeah, okay. We'll go ahead and bring these to the back, and then you can just circulate them and send them forward, and hopefully everybody will have it by the time you Yeah, once you're done. Thank you. So, as Cassandra mentioned, I teach poetry, among other things, at Washburn University, and my classes often begin with a discussion about what poetry is, the definition of poetry. And I ask the students, what do you think poetry is? How do you define it? And they offer different definitions, and I have my own definitions. And I was thinking, it's curious, a curious thing about poetry. Like, I wonder if my other colleagues in other disciplines ever do this. Like, does the art teacher say, what is art at the beginning of the semester? What is painting or sculpture? What is ballet? You know, does the theater professor say, what is a play? Poetry seems like one of those genres that's represents something different to everybody. And so there are often discussions and even debates about how to define it. It's something that we have a little trouble putting our finger on. It's this sort of magical quality that certain things have. Not just poems. If we see LeBron James do a beautiful 360 dunk, we say that's poetry in motion, you know? Anything that moves elegantly or beautifully or artfully is at risk of being identified as pure poetry. We don't do that with other genres. In fact, prose, like, it turns into the adjective prosaic, which is an insult, not a compliment, which is kind of ironic because prose really outsells poetry at the bookstores, you know? But for some reason, things that are prosaic are dull and things that are poetic are exciting. I have my own favorite definitions of poetry. I love W.H. Auden's definition of a poem as memorable speech because I think my love of poetry is linked to my love of talking and my love of language, and that's how I think of my favorite poems. There are things that I love to say aloud, things that were said memorably. Samuel Taylor Coleridge defined poetry as the best words in the best order, which I think is a really fine definition. But my favorite may actually be a definition the poet Stanley Kunitz came up with, which was the title of my talk today. He called poetry turning life into legend. And I don't think I consider that a complete or satisfactory definition of poetry, but I love it because of all these definitions, it's the most fun. It makes poetry sound like the most fun. Oh, I'm going to turn life into legend today. And it also seems to imply that, like, any life is worth turning into legend or turning into myth. Any life justifies that. You don't have to have done something larger than life to have earned the right to turn your life into legend. What is a legend? Well, it's a story about life, but it's often different from life in ways that reveal things that are truer about life than just the facts of the actual story. And the poems that I want to talk about today, I feel like, are may be examples of a poet having turned life into legend. This one by Sherman Alexie is a good example. It's called The Theology of Reptiles. And if you look at it, you can see that it's 14 lines long and is shaped roughly like a sonnet, if anyone has read poetry before. We associate sonnets with, the meditative poems of William Shakespeare, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, and that sort of thing. This is a very contemporary sonnet, and one that tells a story, too. It's a narrative, not just a meditative poem. The Theology of Reptiles. We found a snake dead in mid-molt. It's almost like two snakes, I said. My brother grabbed it by the head and said, it just needs lightning bolts. Laughing, he jumped the creek and draped the snake over an electric fence. Was my brother being cruel? Yes. But we were shocked when that damn snake spiraled off the wire and splayed alive on the grass, made a fist of itself, then, gorgeous and pissed, uncurled, stood on end and swayed for my brother, who, bemused and awed, had somehow become one snake's god. I feel like more people would read poetry if all poems were that interesting. How old do you think the brothers are in this poem? Because it's never said, right, how old they are. How old do you imagine them being? I'm just curious about this. 8 or 9, yeah. Is that what others were thinking?
I think
10. Teenagers, maybe? Did anybody think they were older than teenagers? This seems like a very kid-like thing. A few folks did. That's interesting. This feels very youthful to me. The mischievousness of it, hanging out with your brother, doing random stuff in your free time, finding a snake and it seeming like a good idea to throw it across an electric fence. Like that's a youthful, impetuous thing to do. I suspected, reading this poem for the first time, that some version of that may actually have happened. And I was curious as to what did and didn't happen. Discussing it with a group of students once, one of them pointed out, like I was talking about the finding the snake and maybe the throwing it across the wire as something that may well have happened, but the snake being reincarnated by this act, this lightning bolt of a shock that it got from the electric fence, this revenant snake swaying there in front of them, that seemed like that was embellished, like that maybe that was added. But one of my students said, when snakes shed their skin, like this one is, dead in mid-molt, sometimes they go dormant, like they kind of quiesce, and the snake that they found might actually not have been dead. It might just have been kind of in that dormant state, and it was the throwing it across the electric fence that sort of reawakened it, after which it was understandably angry. I mean, I'm angry when I wake up under normal circumstances. My alarm clock pisses me off. If you throw me across an electric fence, you're going to have an animated Eric there for sure. So. But I was always curious about that. But at the same time, I was aware that the poem exists in its own world, separate from the world of real life events that might have inspired it. But as fate would have it, I used to live in Seattle. And when I lived in Seattle, my kids went to the same grade school as Sherman Alexie's kids. And we used to know each other because we would see each other at like PTA and pancake breakfasts, and stuff like that. And I was like, all right, dang it, this is obnoxious, but I'm going to ask him. I'm going to send him an email and ask him about what really happened. He's a generous enough guy, he might just answer. And sure enough, he did. And I printed out the email here because I thought his answer was really interesting. I'm messing with the audio here. This mic is rather heavy and my shirt is kind of light. He said, my brother picked up a snake we thought was dead and he threw it on the electric fence. And it writhed and fell to the ground and twisted itself in circles, and we ran. In retrospect, I imagine the electrical current contracted a dead snake's muscles. But we were young and afraid, and we were Americans and Native Americans in love with mythology. So we created our own mythology around the event. I love that answer, among other things, because it suggests that the story about the grander event took shape between them. It wasn't just something, he didn't just transform it into legend when he turned it into this poem. The two brothers together kind of conspiratorially had already turned life into legend. Like you sense that maybe they went home and the version that they told their parents of what had happened was actually much closer to the version in this poem than to what actually happened. So it was a mythology for the Alexei brothers, and it was a theology for the snake. I love that title, right? The Theology of Reptiles. This is the story of how my brother became one snake's god. I love the implication of that this snake eventually slithered away and found some other snakes and was like, you guys ain't gonna believe this. Let me tell you about what happened today. I was dead. I swear to God, I was dead in mid-molt, and I was lying there, and then some giant being came along, and suddenly I was alive again. And once the initial wave of anger had passed, I tried to express my gratitude to this being by standing on end and swaying reverentially before it. And then it ran away really quick. I'm not sure why that happened. But anyway, I bring you good news of the new snake god. It is a 13-year-old boy. There's a whole sort of shadow story that exists behind the story that's told in this, very artfully, in this little sonnet here. This line, it's almost like two snakes, is such a childlike line. You know, you see a snake and its skin, you're like, oh, it's almost like two snakes. It's just kind of a throwaway line that one of the brothers says early in the narrative, but by the end we hear that line in an entirely different way, right? Because we have really seen two snakes. We've seen the ordinary of this earth snake, and then we've seen the revenant snake that now worships a human being that's been shocked back to life. The transformation the snake underwent really turns it, in a sense, into a different snake. You see what I mean about turning life into legend? That's precisely what he did. Something kind of interesting happened to him and his brother. I would say very interesting by an 8 or 13 or 10 or 20-year-old standards, you know. But not life-shatteringly interesting. But he twisted it and added to it and embellished it just enough that some deeper truth about the magical experience that he and his brother had shared was revealed, you know. The snake actually being reincarnated by the electric fence turned that life event into sort of a legendary event that nevertheless feels truer than the actual event did. That's how my brother and I experienced it. It was that stunning and startling at the time. This is my advice to you if you all are creative writers. How many here are creative writers? How many here write poetry sometimes? How many here have a book of rhymes? How many here write songs? How many write short stories, fiction? How many have a journal that you write in? Just a way of keeping track of your daily life. Yeah, some here. How many tweet angrily? I'm just curious. It's another short, efficient literary form there. So, yeah. It can be, if you're like me, I don't consider myself an especially imaginative person. When I sit down to write, especially autobiographical poetry, I tend to be constricted, without choosing to be, by what actually happened. Well, I need to write a poem about what happened, and it doesn't occur to me to add things to it that didn't happen. But if I give permission to myself to add things to it, to turn life into legend, then I often end up discovering a poem that feels truer to me in my experience than the one that I had initially set out to write and that I would have written if I had limited myself only to things I had actually experienced. What's your favorite line in this poem? I'm just curious. Everybody has a different one, it seems like. Favorite image? Yeah, go ahead.
Spiraled off the wire and splayed, alive on the grass, made a fist of itself, and gorgeous and pissed, uncurled and stood on end and swayed.
That's nice, isn't it? I love it that it's more than one line, too. Yeah, that's such muscular, rich language, isn't it? All those verbs, spiraled as a verb, right? And splayed and uncurled, made a fist of itself, stood on end, swayed, all these vivid verbs. I mean, that snake-like action that's been observed there is really rendered in those swirling S words, those verbs that he's chosen there. Yeah, it's very, very intentional, a very curated poem. Yeah. Just a love of the language in that long concluding sentence there. I mean, that whole sentence begins with yes. That's the first word in that sentence, and it flows all the way across the remaining stanzas to the end of the poem there. But it never feels like a run-on sentence, like you're getting bogged down in the language, because the language is so interesting. Yeah. Other favorite passages there, other favorite word choice. It just needs lightning bolts. That's right. Yeah, that too is a very kind of impulsive young guy instinct. Like, it's not a dead snake, it's just the snake that needs to be shocked back to life. And this is a big joke, right? I mean, he's just kind of cruelly mocking the the dead snake for a laugh until it actually calls his bluff and comes back to life. And then it's like, oh, I didn't want that. I mean, I think to me this, more than anything, feels like a poem about discovering a power that you didn't realize that you had and not wanting it, like not wanting the responsibility. I don't want to be the snake's god. No, I'm your bemused and odd brother, right? I'm just this gawky, awkward 13-year-old, and all of a sudden you're telling me snakes are worshiping me and they're going to maybe follow me whenever I go. No, I'm not ready for that. No, you guys have it all wrong. Yeah, it just needs lightning bolts. Yeah. We were shocked, right? It's the snake was shocked, but really we were shocked when that damn snake spiraled off the wire. There's a lot happening in those 14 lines. Yeah. Well, let's take a look at a poem by a liberal native, William Stafford, one of my favorite poets. Not born in Liberal, born and grew up in Hutchinson, but spent some really formative teenage years in Liberal, and went on to become the Poet Laureate of the United States, National Book Award winner, and a profoundly influential poet for me. This is a poem about something that took place, I think, in Hutchinson, Kansas, but I'm not positive about that. It's called 15. South of the bridge on 17th, I found back of the willows one summer day a motorcycle with engine running over as it lay on its side. With engine running as it lay on its side, ticking over slowly in the high grass. I was 15. I admired all that pulsing gleam, the shiny flanks, the demure headlights fringed where it lay. I led it gently to the road and stood with that companion, ready and friendly. I was 15. We could find the end of a road, meet the sky out on 17th. I thought about hills, and patting the handle got back a confident opinion. On that bridge, we indulged a forward feeling, a tremble. I was 15. Thinking, back farther in the grass, I found the owner, just coming to, where he had flipped over the rail. He had blood on his hand, was pale. I helped him walk to his machine. He ran his hand over it, called me good man, roared away. I stood there, 15. This is a free verse poem, I suppose you would say. It doesn't have a regular rhyme scheme. It doesn't have a metrical pattern. The stanzas are the same number of lines, except for the final line, which is off there on its own. And there's some sort of incidental rhyme woven through it. It feels very free verse, very kind of spontaneous. But it keeps circling back to this phrase, I was 15, which it modifies then in the final line. So that ends up functioning almost like a chorus in a song. It gives it a little bit of a sense of structure. It feels very important to him that he was 15 at the time that this happened for some reason. He wants to write a poem about 15-ness, about the 15-ness of this experience. And in fact, that last line, the way that word 15 is functioning is really interesting in that last line. I stood there, 15. It's almost like 15 has become an adjective. Like you expect an adjective in that place, like I stood there confused, right? Or I stood there awkward, or I stood there thrilled, or I stood there, what were you going to say? Shocked, something like that, yeah. He allows 15 to kind of fulfill that grammatical role, and in that way kind of turns it into an adjective. I felt very 15 at the end of all of this. That was the most 15 thing that ever happened to me. And that feels true. Sometimes you have to kind of repurpose the language and invite words to do things that they aren't normally accustomed to doing in order to express what you really went through. That motorcycle undergoes some interesting transformations over the course of this poem. Look at that second stanza there, that second group of lines. I admired all that pulsing gleam, the shiny flanks, the demure headlights fringed where it lay. I led it gently to the road and stood with that companion, ready and friendly. If you didn't have the word headlights and you didn't know that it was a motorcycle, you might not think he's talking about a motorcycle there, right? What does it sound like he's describing? A woman, maybe? Interesting, yeah. Another sentient being somehow. Yeah. Maybe a horse, yeah, sort of led it to that companion, led that companion back to the road, ready and friendly. The shiny flanks, terms often used to describe horses, it feels like. He gives the handle a pat later on. I mean, the motorcycle really has a kind of a will or an identity or an agency of its own, it feels like, right? On that bridge, we indulged a forward feeling, a tremble. It's not I, it's we there, right? But he's still alone, right? All he's got is the motorcycle with him, but he and the motorcycle are both indulging this forward feeling, this tremble. I could get on this motorcycle. It's right here. It's running. We, this motorcycle and I, this companion and I, could have an adventure together. Why not? I'm 15. I'm ready for this. You know, he's entertaining the possibility, but kind of keeping himself in check. He's not sure if he's ready to take on 17th Street yet or not. And he's so entranced by this that it doesn't even occur to him. You know, a running motorcycle in the willows. Maybe a rider around here somewhere. I should probably look around, actually. It's not until that next to last stanza there that he's like, oh crap, a running motorcycle. And he goes back and he's like, oh, sir, I'm sorry. This unconscious person's like, thanks for noticing me over here, you know. But then, you know, the guy kind of gets up and gathers himself. He's pale, there's blood on his hand, but he's like, thanks, my good man, hops on the motorcycle and roars away. This guy is used to some rough living, I sort of sense. This may not be the first time he's, this happens every Tuesday. You know, I go over the rail off into the, I'm fine, I'm ready for this. That guy has not been 15 for a long time, right? He's moved on from that. I don't know, what do you feel like this poem is? It's always risky to say what's a poem about. Charles Olson said, a poem is about a subject the way the cat is about a house, you know. But what's the impetus behind this poem? What's its purpose? Or what is it really representing? It's not just about a kid finding a motorcycle, I don't think. I feel like there's something essential about human experience he's trying to say there. Yeah.
I feel like with the reiteration of I was 15,
Right.
it gives you this sense of childishness, a sense of wonder and youth, in the sense of he doesn't really understand. You know, at first
Right.
he doesn't think anything of the motorcycle laying on the grass, and then he goes back and he looks again and is shocked to find that the rider has flipped over the rail.
Right.
And so that last line there, I stood there, 15, kind of brings an echo of disturbance
Right.
to the whole thing.
Good. It makes you realize what a kind of a pivotal age 15 is. This would be a very different poem if he were 18, or if he were 11, you know, when this happened. 15 is like you've just entered your teenage years, and you're starting to feel in some ways maybe like more of an adult, you know, but you're not sure about that, nor are you sure that you want all the responsibility and obligation and burden that comes along with that. And at different times, it's almost like he's different ages at different points in the poem. When he's indulging that forward feeling, he's about to lurch forward into the later years of teenagehood, where he might be more reckless and braver, but also more competent, more capable of handling the motorcycle. Who knows, you know? But there's part of him you sense that's looking back too, like I'm not ready even to be 15 yet. And for the opportunity that I've been given here, I don't feel like this is a choice I'm capable of making. And then finding the writer, once he kind of comes to his senses, once they both come to their senses, sort of gets him out of that dilemma. But yeah, at 15, he's on the precipice of some real change, and that feels like that's the poem's big concern for me. So I heard William Stafford's son, Kim Stafford. William Stafford passed away in the early 1990s. In 2014, we had a big celebration for the 100th birthday of William Stafford at Washburn, and his son, Kim, came back and was the keynote speaker there. And he read this poem, and he introduced it, or maybe he's speaking after it. He told a little story about this poem's composition, and I hope I'm remembering it accurately. It's been a few years now, but what I recall him saying was that someone asked William Stafford at one point, so the story in 15 with the motorcycle and everything, like, did that all actually happen? And Stafford said, oh yeah, that absolutely happened. Yeah. Well, there was no rider. There was actually no rider of the motorcycle, but there was and then the motorcycle was not actually running at the time. But other than that, well, and it wasn't a motorcycle, it was a bicycle. But and it looked like it had been there a while, like there were some moss and, weeds growing over it and stuff like that. Which is to say, he did not find a running motorcycle by the side of the road when he was 15. He found an old-ass bicycle that had been sitting in the weeds for ages, maybe a decade or more, that had just been abandoned there at some point. It's like the Dr. Seuss book, And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street. Has anybody ever read that book before, where the kid sees a horse and cart coming home from school? It's like the boring horse and cart, but as he's continuing to walk home from school, he starts mentally transforming into, well, what if it was a zebra rather than a horse pulling the cart, and adds more and more to it. And by the time he gets home, it's this whole grand parade that he witnessed, with airplanes flying over and elephants and, just every imaginable spectacular thing. And this feels a little bit like a version of that. Yeah, I found an old abandoned bicycle in the weeds when I was 15, but that got my mind going. What if it weren't a bike? What if it were a motorcycle? And what if it hadn't been there for a while? What if it was freshly there? It was still running, in fact. What if its rider was right by it? I mean, a still running motorcycle probably has a rider not far away. What if that happened? And it was those aspects of it that both allowed him to turn life into legend, into something more weighty and seemingly significant, but also to get at the fundamental truth that he was trying to write about, which is how it feels to be 15, I think. He was able to write more accurately about that by taking these liberties with the facts. A great cliche that creative writing instructors often use, a great adage, I should say, because we're allergic to cliches, but we all say, write what you know. And that's true and useful, because the things that you know, you're able to write about vividly, precisely, draw on a lot of context and create, and you'll have some urgency about it. And if it's what you know, then it's what you're invested in, what you're interested in. It forms part of who you are. My friend Ben Lerner, a poet and novelist from Topeka, modified that in a way that I think is really beneficial. He said, write what you know, but lie about it. It's much better, right? It's much better that way, because then you have the truth and the falsehood and the greater truth that the two together can sort of synthesize. Let me show you really quickly a poem that I wrote that I think of as sort of an example of turning life into legend. It doesn't have any, I'm sorry that it doesn't have anything as interesting as a flipped motorcycle or a shocked back to life snake in it, but it's the best I could do at the time. And I may need you to, make it a little smaller there, maybe, or, there we go. Close enough, okay. Sorry. This is called Your Back, and it's sort of derived from my experience moving back to my hometown, Topeka, Kansas, after 13 years away. And it's in 4 sections. Your Back. You went away and they went on without you. When you reappeared with kids and an ironic beard, the ticket carousel was full. They'd finally stopped taking orders from east of Dougal and redrawn the map's eccentric ballpoint borders. The dough hook dervished in its bowl. Home is where your references aren't recognized or needed. When you have to go back, they have to clock you in. The only other differences were little changes to the menu. Nobody asked you where you'd been. 2. Your daughter didn't have a single friend named Stephanie, in soccer or at school. Nobody screamed the name at either end of the public pool. And you began to understand and mourn that there would have to be a great-grandmother named Stephanie before there could be another Stephanie born. And the 3 Stephanies who gave the name its amplitude, the Stephanies of myth, kept showing up at Kroger and became the Stephanies you went to high school with. Thank you, Cassandra. Section 3. You went away and they went on like that, as though you hadn't gone, still doing it the way they'd learned to do it, and that only they still do it, and the only way, as far as they're concerned. Then you came back and said, I knew it, and told them you were unaware of anybody anywhere still doing it the way they do it, and they said, you don't say. 4. Only your first grade teacher looked the same, uncannily, because it was her daughter. She had the makeup and had kept the name. She even had the belly you could rub for good luck when she brought you into sub, and she had plans to finish out the year But you'd been through this once before. Her water would break at recess and she'd disappear for 30 years and you'd be back like Cotter. Back to the blackboard, suddenly unsure of how best to distinguish your from your. You're back and bigger. Better watch your back. Don't strain it sipping from those tiny fountains. You're sad because your blackboard isn't black. You're teaching them your harmlessly subversive verse choruses to Cielito Lindo and other lovely, useless things like cursive. You're staring out your modular's one window, turning the thunderheads to thunder mountains. I was happy to see a line of thunderheads on the horizon when I got here last night, and I was thinking, oh yes, surely the grade school children of liberal Kansas must do what we did in Topeka when we were bored, which is stare out the window and see the line of thunderheads and imagine instead that it's a mountain range that I could go disappear into, that's more interesting than this place where I'm learning cursive, or whatever it is that I'm being taught. So yeah, as I say, I moved back to Topeka in 2009 after 13 or so years away. It's very, very strange to be back in your hometown after a long time away. It both is and isn't the place that you grew up in, of course, because my hometown wasn't Topeka in 2009. My hometown was Topeka in 1982, and I can't go back to that, ever. It's changed a lot. In a lot of ways, it is still vividly, conspicuously the same. But you have changed, and so you're experiencing it differently now and with a different perspective. And I wanted to get at that somehow in a poem. It felt urgent enough, and it was liberating to realize I could lie about my experiences being back. I did not go back and work at a pizza restaurant, as you in the first section did. I did work at a pizza restaurant when I was in my early 20s living in Topeka, and so imagining going back and working there again turned out to be kind of creatively nourishing or a useful sort of prompt for me. I definitely did not go back and teach at my old grade school as a substitute teacher or otherwise, but imagining doing that was really creatively invigorating for me as well. What would that be like? What if I went back and my first grade teacher was there and looked exactly the same, but it turned out that was because it was her daughter who was now teaching there. Everything is a cycle that sort of repeats itself. And I feel like I did have experiences that were this uncanny being back in my hometown. One day I picked my daughter up from her daycare, which was also the daycare I had gone to in the 1970s, and they had out these old photo albums of the history of the daycare, including old black and white square photographs from the early 70s, and there was little toddler me running around on the playground. So I picked my daughter up, and then we went out to the retirement home where my grandmother, her great-grandmother, was living, which was the same retirement home like 3 doors down from where my great-grandmother had been living when I was a kid. And I was like, we're doing exactly what we did. I get it, okay? It's all a cycle. The seasons go round and round. The painted ponies go up and down, and I'm just participating in, you think the world is original, you think your experiences are absolutely new when you're younger, and it's when you're older you realize in so many ways, I'm simply, contributing my portion of the pattern here, contributing my square to the quilt or whatever metaphor you choose to favor. But for some reason it was lying about things a little bit that allowed me to get at what felt truer to me, the experience of moving back. And interestingly, this shift into the second person was, I think, part of what catalyzed it. I was starting to write this poem as a first-person poem. I'm back, that kind of thing. This is what it's like being back in my hometown. And I wasn't getting anywhere with it. And I shifted at some point to you. I'm making it a poem about you, not a poem about me. And then I was sort of free to lie all I wanted to. I can make up all kinds of stuff about you. I know what happened to me. I don't know what happened to you. So if I make it about you, then I can just BS my way through the rest of it. And that turned out to be a really breakthrough moment for that poem, is that point of view shift. So sometimes to turn life into legend, it can be helpful to trick yourself somehow. Change the prompt just a little bit. Change the assignment that you're giving yourself just a little bit. And you'll be just surprised at what you discover that you have to say. So as I said, I cheated by asking Sherman Alexie how he got the idea for the Theology of Reptiles, and I cheated by borrowing Kim Stafford's story about William Stafford turning life into legend in the poem 15. So if you all want to cheat and ask me any questions about this poem, I would be happy to give you the backstory. Which is not to say that the backstory is essential to understanding the poem. I hope it's not. I hope the poem stands on its own, but yeah. You know, one thing that is true in here, I will tell you, I feel like the truest section of this poem is the second section. Your daughter didn't have a single friend named Stephanie in soccer or at school. It's a little slight section of that poem, but I'm actually really proud of that section because it struck me as a really interesting way to convey the passage of time, the generational shift that had changed from when I previously lived in Topeka to when I live there now. One of the things that changes is names, you know, the names that people are given. And no name goes away as completely as a name that was popular like a generation before, you know, or something like that. They come around every 3 or 4 generations, which is why I say once there's a great-grandmother named Stephanie, then there can be another Stephanie. But right now, you're not, it's an odd, you know, it's conspicuous when you go back to your hometown and a building that used to be there isn't there anymore. It's a little subtler when you go back and you just never hear the name Stephanie spoken by children. You only hear it spoken by adults, you know. So if you go to the public pool, neither at the shallow end nor at the deep end is anyone yelling, Stephanie! And that's a way that the town was completely different from how it was when I was a kid. In 1982, if you went to the Gage Park public pool, you would hear Stephanie shouted at some point over the course of the afternoon. It's a subtle change, but it's the kind of change that comes home to you once you recognize it, because it makes you realize how different the world is and how different you are, having changed over all those years in the world. Now, a generation from now, somebody will be writing the same poem about maybe the name Madison or the name Sophia or something like that. And this is an interesting thing, by the way, about naming. I've discovered now that I have a couple kids. When you pick a name for your kid, you think you're picking a really original name because you don't know anybody else, you know, that has that name. And you think, my kid is going to be the only kid that has this name. And then you go to the park and there are 10 other kids with that name there because 10 other people had the same idea at the same time. My name is Eric. You look at the map of name popularity, Eric peaked in about 1972, which coincidentally or not was the year that I was born. A lot of names that were popular when I was a kid, Ryan, Kevin. You just, if you know a Ryan or a Kevin, it's probably not a 12-year-old right now, right? You know, it's probably somebody, you know, closer to my age. And Stephanie and Heather and Jennifer are sort of the same way. Like, these are the names that, like, man, in 1989, if you didn't know a teenage girl's name, just guess Stephanie, Heather, or Jennifer. You were probably right, at least in the towns in which I lived. You know, like, it was a safe guess. And so that's a major shift, a subtle shift, but a major shift. And recognizing that felt like one way of illuminating this uncanny "you're back" feeling. Any questions about any of these poems, or any observations that I haven't made?
Do you know the age this fellow was when he wrote 15?
That's a good question.
Did he do it at that time, or was it later in life?
It would have been probably later in life. Stafford's career as a poet got started a little on the later side. And it's interesting, he moved from Kansas to Oregon and lived almost all of his adult years in Oregon and taught at Lewis and Clark College out in Portland. But that was when he really began writing about Kansas. Like, so much of his poetic career was spent writing poems about Kansas, and specifically central and western Kansas, where he had spent his youth. In fact, there's a famous story about someone saying to him, you know, Bill, why do you keep writing about Kansas? I mean, what's wrong with Oregon? You've been in Oregon all this time. Don't you like Oregon? And Stafford said, oh yeah, Oregon is, you know, it's fine, but all these mountains and trees, they kind of get in the way of the scenery. If you're a Kansas kid, the scenery is the skyscape, you know, it's not the landscape. And so the mountains and trees were obstructions as far as he was
I remember
concerned.
saying on a trip one time, if they cut down some of these trees, you could see the scenery.
You could really see, that's right. That was exactly his attitude, yeah. So I suspect that he was probably, you know, this is actually gives me an opportunity for a good note to kind of close my talking portion on, although I'll be happy to have a continued conversation with questions and answers. Driving down from North on 83 last night, I was remembering that one of my favorite William Stafford poems, and I think it's kind of a representative poem from that part of his career, is set a mile north of Liberal. In fact, the first line is on a frozen pond a mile north of Liberal. So let me share that William Stafford poem with you as an invitation to read more William Stafford and maybe to find more inspiration for turning your own life into legend. It's called One Evening. On a frozen pond a mile north of Liberal, almost 60 years ago, I skated wild circles while a strange, pale sun went down. A scattering of dry brown reeds cluttered the ice at one end of the pond, and a fitful breeze ghosted little surface eddies of snow. No house was in sight, no tree, only the arched wide surface of the earth, holding the pond and me under the sky. I would go home, confront all my years, the tangled events to come, and never know more than I did that evening, waving my arms in the lemon-colored light. William Stafford, not half bad. Other questions about the Theology of Reptiles, 15, You're Back, Turning Life into Legend? Folks are eyeing the cookies eagerly here, so I think, why don't we wrap it up there? Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. This has been a real pleasure. Thanks again, Seward County Community College.
Thank you, Eric, and remember, before you leave, fill one of these out, exchange it at the front desk for a journal.